That's a lot. But that's
really one of the most special ones that we've done to talk about Mike Mansfield, his international legacy, and we're very pleased to have with us Don Oberdorfer, who will share with us some insights about Mansfield's life and his career. The program is special to us for another reason, and that is we're very pleased to have as a co-host or a co-sponsor the Montana Kaiman. The Kaiman is the campus newspaper of the University of Montana. In a moment I'll formally introduce Don, but before that I want to invite Courtney Lowry to come up and say a few words. Courtney is the editor of the Kaiman. She's been in that post for about a year. She's a student at the university, a journalism major. Her writing has earned national recognition from the Hearst Journalism Awards program. She's a native of Montana. She's from the heart of the Golden Triangle in Dutton. So welcome, Courtney Lowry, please.
Hello and good evening. On behalf of the Montana Kaiman and the Montana World Affairs Council, I would like to give you the warmest of welcomes for tonight's tribute to Mike Mansfield. We are extremely honored to have such a distinguished journalist with us tonight to help us remember and better understand the legacy that Mike Mansfield has left on our campus, on our state, on our nation, and in our world. So tonight I'd like to thank you so much for coming, and I'd also like to thank you, and I don't think that I'm alone in thanking you for this, for coming out to support events like this. Because it's nights like these that help us keep the vision of Mike Mansfield in Montana and in the country alive today. So thank you very much.
You can all read the Kaiman either in print or online. It's kaiman.org, and it's a wonderful newspaper. If you want to know where to go to hear good rap music, Kaiman will tell you that. Charlie and I wonder about that from time to time. But if you want to know what's going on in the community and on the campus, the Kaiman will tell you that, and he will tell you that very well, so it's a wonderful paper. I'm not going to tell you how many years Don Oberdorfer has spent in journalism. However, I did read that he started a newspaper when he was still in grammar school in his native Georgia. I know that he was editor of his high school paper, and I know that he was editor of his university paper at Princeton University, where he graduated. He's had a distinguished career at the Washington Post. 17 of those years were spent as the diplomatic correspondent, and it was during a period of a very interesting and turbulent period in American foreign policy. So Don was present at all of these events. He had also served as the Post White House correspondent during the Nixon administration. He covered Asia as the Post bureau chief in Tokyo. He's the author of two very significant books on Asia, one called Tet, a study of the war in Vietnam, and the other called The Two Koreas, really the definitive work of the Korean Peninsula. And Don has spent a lot of time covering, as I said, major events in the world. He and I were at the State Department at about the same time, but I never had the pleasure of being interviewed by Don. I was very junior at the time, which is sort of a polite way of saying I didn't have any information that was worth being interviewed for. But I know people that were interviewed, and what they told me about Don was that he was tough, that he was good, and that he was fair. And I think that's very high praise in Washington. He's currently hard at work on what will be the definitive biography of Mike Mansfield. I think he's at chapter 9 in what I believe will be a 12-chapter book. But he's got a lot of ground to cover, and he'll be interested in, after his talk, hearing from you, your comments and your questions, and he'll welcome that. Don is currently the journalist in residence and an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies in Washington. and his wife Laura live in Northwest Washington, D.C. And they have 2 grown children. So please join me in welcoming back to Missoula, back to Montana, Don Oberdorfer.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Courtney. I'm delighted to be here. I'm especially honored to be here in Montana talking about Mike Mansfield, Montana's favorite son, as it were. What a person he was. I had known him a little bit when he was Senate Democratic leader, which he was, as you know, for 16 years. He would never say under, he would say with Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. And I knew him a little better when he was ambassador to Japan, but I didn't really know him that well until I started work on this book. He'd always said he wanted nothing to do with memoirs, with writing any memoirs. He only did 2 oral histories in his life, one for the John Foster Dulles program at Princeton and one for the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston. And he was not interested in memoirs and anybody writing his biography. I once asked him how he'd like to be remembered, and he answered, when I'm gone, I'd like to be forgotten. I don't think it was entirely opposed either. I mean, he was an extraordinarily humble person. He considered himself an ordinary human being who just happened to have a lot of good breaks. The most foremost of which, in his mind, was meeting Maureen Hayes, who he married in Butte. You will notice that it is the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Library. It is the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation. There's a statue on the campus of the 2 of them. There's a statue in Helena at the Capitol, where I'm going to go tomorrow, of the 2 of them. When the legislative committee called up Mansfield, Ambassador Mansfield, in Washington a few years ago, after he had retired from government service and joined the Goldman Sachs International Financial Organization, and said that they wanted to erect a statue of him in the Capitol, which would be only the 3rd, I believe, Jeanette Rankin and Senator Walsh. And his immediate answer was, if it's just me, no. If it's me and Maureen, okay. Well, you wonder, because there's just nobody else in public life that I know of that pays that much, gives that much fealty publicly to his spouse. But if you know a little bit about his history, it becomes a little more understandable. He was a miner in Butte, a copper miner, in the copper mines of Butte for 9 years. After he had been in the Navy, underage in the Navy in World War I, at age 14, lying about his age and telling them that he was 17. After he had been in the Army and the Marines, he came back to Montana. He was a copper miner. He was basically a penniless copper miner. There was, in those days, he paid what was considered good money for a working class wage. And he met this young woman whose father was a prominent businessman who had run for mayor. They lived in a house at the top of the Butte Hill. She had a 4-year college education, plus 2 semesters of graduate school at Berkeley and UCLA. Quite beautiful. She worked as the English teacher at Butte High School. And she met this penniless copper miner, and the 2 of them fell in love. I mean, it's an amazing story. And she insisted that he get out of the mines. and get an education. He hadn't even finished the 8th grade. And she helped him to persuade the university, then called Montana State University, but now the university that we know here in Missoula, to accept him as a special student with the provision that he would have to finish his high school equivalency before he could get his college degree. And she helped him do that. And the semester before he graduated from university, he got his high school certificate with her help. And then it was she who insisted that he get into politics. Her father, as I said, had been in politics. I am certain that Mike Mansfield would never have gone into politics. He was much too self-effacing to have done that on his own. Now I'm off on that other subject. I'm supposed to talk about international relations. And I don't worry, I'll get there. It says after all the World Affairs Council, right? But at any rate, theirs was an amazing story together. And he, whenever I mentioned something about the book, there were two things he said. The first thing he said, if ever I mentioned his biography, he'd say it's unauthorized, which was true. He never really formally agreed to it. I just did it. And the other thing he'd say is, are you giving enough credit to Maureen? And I'd say, yes, I am. And I will. At any rate, Mansfield, as a young boy, he was born in New York. His parents were Irish immigrants who didn't come over from Ireland together. They both went through Ellis Island, but separately. They met in New York. When he was 7 years old, his mother died. His father was a construction worker who had fallen from a 35-foot brick wall and broke, somebody said, most of the bones. Well, that probably wasn't literally true. Broken many bones and was being nursed back to health in a Catholic hospital. Couldn't take care of this 7-year-old boy and 2 younger sisters. And so he got hold of an uncle who was living in Great Falls. And the aunt came east, took the 3 children on the train. 3 days, I think it took, to go from New York to Great Falls. Great Falls in those days had wooden sidewalks. It was like the edge of the frontier. And this young boy wasn't really happy there. The uncle died after a year after Mike arrived. The aunt and uncle had never had children, and she didn't really know how to deal with this rambunctious kid. He ran away from home. She put him in the state home for wayward children in Twin Bridges for a year. He came back, he ran away from home, but through all this, he was a great reader for his age. And he read the stories about faraway places, about Tibet, Mount Kilimanjaro, places like this, and got a real thirst for going elsewhere, going to exotic places in the world, which he was able to do for the first time in the early 1920s as a Marine. He'd been in the Navy in World War I, as I said, underage. Then he joined the Army, and he didn't care for that, and he joined the Marines, which sent him to the Philippines. And one day in 1922, a group of Marines was selected to go to China. And he said it was my lucky day. He was included. He went to China. He was only there for about 2 weeks, but it whetted his appetite, that and the Philippines experience, for faraway places. And he was always fascinated with Asia, and particularly with China after that. He came back here, became a copper miner, then went to the university, got a graduate, got an MA, and was the first professor of Far Eastern history at the University of Montana, and one of the first in the country to have that specialty. Then he was elected to Congress. And shortly after he got to Congress, he persuaded Franklin D. Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, to send him to China on a mission to study what was going on in China between the Chinese nationalists headed by Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese communists. This is 1944. He came back and made a report to the House of Representatives, which he was a member of. He was on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and then he started making a speech once a month on the House floor about Asia. He quickly became recognized as the preeminent congressional expert, House expert on Asia. And when the NBC television network wanted somebody to talk about the war in the Far East, they got Mansfield to do it in a nationwide broadcast as a freshman Democrat in the House. He was always very interested in what was going on in the world. That interest was second only, really, to Montana. Throughout his congressional career, he got to his office very early, before 7 o'clock in the morning. He'd open the mail, often himself. The mail would be in two piles. One was Montana, and one was everything else. And he'd open the Montana ones, and he would answer, he would write a personal response to every letter that he got. But Asia was also part of his life. And he made a number of trips to Asia and other places until he was elected to the Senate in 1952, after having been in the House for 10 years. He was elected in 42. In the dirtiest, one of the dirtiest campaigns that Montana has ever seen. The Republicans sent out Joe McCarthy, the anti-communist, communist-baiting demagogue, and a man named Harvey Matusow, who just recently died, a former communist for hire, who came out and falsely claimed that Mansfield was the next thing to a communist. He'd written for the Daily Worker and so forth and so on. A bunch of pack of lies, as Matusow finally admitted a few years later. Mansfield told me that if he knew what that campaign was going to be like, he would never have won. But he won narrowly in 1952, a year when Republicans won almost all the offices, because that was the first year of President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower was at the top of the ticket, and they did very, very well. At any rate, after he was elected to the Senate, he was immediately, again, on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, courtesy of Lyndon Johnson, who put him on the committee. It was rare for a freshman, because in those days that was one of the most prestigious committees of Congress. And he immediately started traveling. And he started traveling to Indochina. 1953, he was elected in 52. 53, he was brand new freshman. He went to Indochina, went to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, went back again in 54, went back again in 55. He knew a lot about Indochina. He'd been out there, he'd met the people, he'd seen the situations. And there are two ironies in this. One is that he had met Ngo Dinh Diem, who was the first president of South Vietnam after the Geneva Conference split Vietnam. And he was very taken with Diem. He was looking for a person who was both anti-colonialist and anti-communist, because he thought only such a person could survive. He found him in Diem, found that person in Diem, and he backed him very strongly. In fact, the State Department, under John Foster Dulles, used Mansfield as its argument why they should not depose Diem, because a lot of people wanted to get rid of him, even in the middle 50s. The irony is that if Mansfield had not gone to bat for Diem as he did, he probably would have been deposed, and the United States might just have gotten out of Vietnam at that point, and we'd never had what later developed. The second irony about the whole thing is that he kept telling Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon not to get deeply involved in Vietnam, not to send American troops or to get American troops out. And he was telling a bunch of people sitting around tables in the White House who felt they knew it all and had these theories, but none of them had anywhere near the experience in Indochina that he had. He knew what he was talking about. The people he was talking about, he was talking to, thought they knew what was going on, but most of them had never been there, or had only been there very slightly, or recently. So he spent a lot of his life in the Congress, particularly in the Senate, counseling presidents, often privately, memorandums sending to them or discussions, which he did not make public. They're in his archives out there in Missoula in the library, but they were not made public at the time, and they were really not known. And they were so prescient. He was telling them exactly what was going to happen. At one point, he even said, I think if you keep on this course, you're going to have 500,000 troops there. The United States ended up several years later with 545,000 troops. That was at the top. He was also very interested in China. And he talked to President Kennedy about repairing U.S. relations with China. And he had quite a number of private meetings with President Nixon on the same subject. And was instrumental, really, in getting the U.S.-China relationship going. And he and the Republican leader at the time, Hugh Scott, Republican Senate leader, were the first two to go to China after President Nixon went in February, or maybe it was March. We just celebrated the 30th anniversary of it in 1972. But the next ones to go were Mansfield and Scott, and he made 3 official trips to China in 72, 75, and 76, 74 and 76. And then, of course, he was our ambassador to Japan under both President Carter and President Reagan, who practically didn't agree on anything else besides that. I was telling Mark tonight a little bit about the story of how he happened to be sent by President Reagan. It's an interesting story. Carter had selected him. That was a little bit normal, I suppose. He'd been the leader of the Senate. The Democratic leader of the Senate for 16 years, longer than anybody else in American history. He knew Carter. Carter knew Mansfield. In fact, Carter wanted Mansfield to be his ambassador to all of Asia, which is not a practical thing. The State Department immediately objected to the idea. But whenever Carter met with ambassadors from Asia, our ambassadors and U.S. ambassadors, he told them they should pay attention to whatever Mike Mansfield said, and he treated him as his senior advisor among ambassadors on Asia. Figuring how he made this relationship with Ronald Reagan is a little more difficult. Reagan came out to Japan as governor of California when he was thinking about running for president. Actually, he was visiting Taiwan, but he decided to stop by Japan. And someone told him the proper thing to do would be to call up the American ambassador, Mike Mansfield. He didn't think he was going to like Mansfield. Mansfield had been a liberal Democrat in the Senate. Reagan was a conservative Republican, of course. Mansfield had, among other things, put on quite a campaign to bring half of the American troops home from Europe on the grounds that they weren't needed there and that they weren't effective there. They were all there with their wives and families and children and cars and houses, and the Mansfield couldn't see how they were really going to do anything if there was an actual, if the Russians actually invaded. What are these guys going to do? He thought there were too many. At any rate, Reagan didn't like that idea at all. But he sent word that he'd like to call on the ambassador. Mansfield's response was immediate. No, I'm going to call on the governor. So he left the embassy, went over to the hotel where Governor Reagan was staying, which happened to be right across the street from the embassy. And he paid a call on Governor Reagan. And while there, he filled him in on the situation in Japan. He had a wonderful, Mansfield had a marvelous facility for taking a complicated subject and just explaining it bing, 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 like that, in ways anyone could grasp, with all of the facts and figures, numbers and everything else right in his head. And when he left, Reagan said to the people there with him, I really like that man. What a terrific person. Then, when Reagan was elected, and they were trying to figure out how to work with the Democrats in the Senate, among other things, they had some controversial nominations to be confirmed. Someone suggested the greatest thing that he could do would be to keep Mansfield on as his ambassador. Reagan was meeting with the Democrats, Senate Democrats, in the Ronald Reagan room in the Capitol, which had been named in honor of Mansfield. And there was an oil portrait of Mike Mansfield on the wall. Reagan went up to this meeting. He had his usual cue cards in his hand. He gave his speech. He put his cue cards in his pocket. And then he said, just one more thing. Just before I came up here, I had a talk with your former leader. And he looked up at the picture there behind him. And he's agreed to stay on as my ambassador to Japan. And the room erupted in standing ovation and applause. Well, that helped smooth the way for Ronald Reagan, but under normal circumstances, that might have meant he would be there for a year or two, something like that. In fact, he was there for the entire 8 years of Ronald Reagan. Whenever Mansfield would come back to Washington and brief Reagan, he would use these same wonderful, clear, crisp techniques of explaining things that way. And Reagan really liked him. And every time somebody would start to say, well, you know, he's been there quite a while, maybe think about sending somebody else to Japan, Reagan would not hear of it. George Shultz was his Secretary of State for most of the Reagan years, after he took over from Alexander Haig in the middle of 1982. And Shultz had a practice that whenever, all American ambassadors, when they go out to their post, normally call on the Secretary of State. It's one of the last things they do, make an official call before they go out to their post. Shultz had a practice of having the ambassador go over to the big globe in the Secretary of State's office and identify the country that they're going to. And even though Mansfield had been in Japan, by that time, for over 5 years, he said, Mike, you know, I've got this practice, and you know, I can't treat you any differently than I have everybody else. Now, go over to that globe and show me your country. And Mansfield went over to the globe, he spun it around, and he put his hand right on the United States. He said, that's my country. Shultz told that story many times. It's the only person who ever did that. And Ronald Reagan, on the last day he was in office, January the 19th of 1989, gave the Medal of Freedom to two people, George Shultz and Mike Mansfield. It's the highest award that can be given to an American civilian. And he deserved it. I could tell you many other things, but I'd rather respond to your questions or comments, and if you have anything that you can tell me about Mike Mansfield, I'm all ears. So, the floor is yours.
Let me start with the inevitable question, I guess. Mike Mansfield had correspondences with a whole string of presidents. What do you think he would be telling our present president about the foreign policy the U.S. should be following today?
Well, I don't really want to answer that question because I don't want to try to put words in his mouth. He's not here. I don't think it's fair for me to say what he would have thought because I don't know what he would have thought. He wasn't very happy with some of the things in the initial part of the George W. Bush administration. But that was, although he died after September 11th, I only saw him once after September 11th, and that was not an interview. It was really, I went to his apartment but the story, this is not answering your question, but the story itself is interesting. As I said, his mother died when he was a child, but he never knew exactly when she died or why. And then he was shipped out to Montana. And I brought him, on that last occasion, to his apartment 10 days before he died, a copy of his mother's death certificate. He was very much moved by it, because it finally told him when it was and how old he was. I mean, it's been reported that he was 3, that he was 5, that he was 6, that he was 8. He was 7 years old. And she died of nephritis, which is a kidney disorder, not the flu, which has usually been written. Anyway, I don't really want to say what he would think because I don't know what he would say, and I don't want to put words into his mouth that he's not here to do.
I was wondering if he attended the '68 Chicago convention, or that kind of seems like something he'd stay away from, or do you know?
1968, I'm sure he probably was there as a delegate from Montana, but I don't know anything about his attendance there. I do know, and it is on record, that he was very much opposed to the Vietnam escalation for American troops in Vietnam. At the same time, he was very much opposed and outspokenly opposed to any kind of demonstration that was not orderly. He was much against any kind of violent or acting out types of demonstration. He was a person who believed in the kind of proper order regarding government. And even though, I mean, I've been looking just this week at some of the things that he was saying internally to his fellow Democrats during the period of heightened escalation in Vietnam, particularly with President Johnson. And he was telling Johnson not to do this in no uncertain terms. There were 3 meetings at the White House, 3 important meetings before each one of Johnson's major escalatory moves. One is before they did the first bombing of North Vietnam. One is before they began regular bombing of North Vietnam, and one is before they sent American ground troops in large numbers. And in each of those meetings, Mansfield was included as Senate Democratic leader. I went around the room. Most of the people there were Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, various military people. Everybody in the room, Johnson insisted on going around saying, "Do you agree?" Everybody in the room agreed except for Mike Mansfield. And he said outspokenly, "No, I don't agree. I don't think this is a good thing to do. I think it's wrong. I think it goes way beyond our national interest." They didn't listen to him. At the same time, he was telling the Senate Democrats, you have to understand the pressures that President Johnson is under. You've got to realize he has these terrific pressures. You've got to have some degree of, I don't know that he used the word sympathy, but understanding for what he's doing, even though he vitally and adamantly opposed it. And he opposed the war. He also opposed not free expression of people's views, but he opposed any kind of demonstration that was violent or out of order. I'll get back to Korea. And what was the other country? Vietnam in a moment. But I'm going to tell you one thing about China, because it's an interesting story. He says a lot about Mansfield. President Clinton, in his last year, sent to Capitol Hill the legislation to create normal trade relations with the People's Republic of China. And he had a big display at the White House of unity. He brought in some prominent Republicans, including James Baker, who had been Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, who had been Clinton's earlier first-term Secretary of State, and others. And he invited Mike Mansfield, not to speak, but to be present. And at this ceremony, President Clinton paid a special tribute to Mike Mansfield, saying, there's one person here who I just have to say something special about because he's been working on these things longer than anybody else in our country. I saw Mansfield a couple of weeks after that, one of my regular talks with him, and I said, here you've been down at the White House. He said, yes, that's right. I said, well, what'd you think of it? He said, talk. I said, what was your role? He said, window dressing. It was so Mansfield. And anyway, he did follow China closely. On Korea, he also followed Korea closely, and he was a great fan of Kim Dae-jung, the current president of South Korea, who has tried to make a rapprochement with North Korea, who had, in the year 2000, I want to say last year, but now, of course, it's the year before, going up to North Korea, had met with Kim Jong-il, the leader of North Korea. He thought Kim Dae-jung was doing exactly the right thing. He praised him, and interestingly enough, when Mansfield died, the Korean ambassador brought to his funeral a personal letter written by Kim Dae-jung to present to Mansfield's daughter, Anne. With regard to Vietnam, people tend to forget this because it was not a major part of Mansfield's career, but after President Carter took over, a delegation went from Washington to Hanoi to try to work out these POW issues, MIA issues. And Mansfield was one of the members of that delegation, so he did finally get to Vietnam. He, like with China, he wanted to see an improved relationship with Vietnam. He didn't feel that Vietnam was making the progress that China has been making. He followed Asia very closely. Goldman Sachs hired him to be an advisor on Asia, and he took it extremely seriously. He read 7 or 8 newspapers every day and would talk to people, whether they were visitors from those countries or experts in Washington, even people like me. When I came back from my trips in Asia, we'd sit down and I'd tell him who I'd seen and what was going on, and he was always very interested. So he kept up with all those things.
You alluded to it earlier about opening Montana mail. And the common perception here in the state is that he, in spite of all of his worldly affairs, he really took care of Montana citizens. And that's not really a folk hero story, but I really believe it's true. But what did he have to say about that?
Well, you know, I didn't ask him, did you take care of Montana citizens, because I knew he did. I asked him once what he was most proud of in his congressional career. And he said, this may surprise you, he said, but the thing I'm most proud of was saving Flathead Lake. There was a plan to flood that whole area, create a giant dam during the war. And Mansfield was adamant that this should not be done. It would, the whole area up there around Kalispell and Flatheads would have been underwater had they done that. I am convinced that the real reason for this plan was something that was not announced at the time. It was to provide power for the nuclear facility out in the state of Washington in Hanford. I asked Mansfield if he knew that. He said no. I said, had you known, if you'd known it, would it have made any difference to you? He said no. At any rate, he did pay a lot of attention to Montana things. And there's some wonderful stories about when legislation regarding Montana, or that was important to him and Montanans, would get in trouble or would be things started mysteriously to happen. And they always happened in the same direction. And he made sure that Montana, which he said, my job is to represent Montana. These other things come second. He turned down, when he was even in the House, they wanted to make him an Assistant Secretary of State, and they wanted to make Truman wanted to make him Assistant Secretary of the Interior. He said no. Johnson talked to him about putting his name in for Vice President. He said no. He did not want any other job than being Senator from Montana. And in fact, he didn't want the job of being Senate Democratic leader. They had to convince him to take it. Jack Kennedy, who was his friend, initially convinced him to do it. He didn't want to do it. He said, I'm quite content being Senator from Montana. And this was one of his strengths, because the other politicians and other people in Washington knew he was not ambitious to do these things. He was doing it because they insisted that he do it. So there came a time when there was a lot of criticism of him, and he made a speech in which he said, I am what I am, and I'm perfectly happy to give this thing up. Let somebody else take it over. But of course, they did not want him to do that. But yes, he took care of Montana.
I'd like to follow up on your comment about his feeling about nuclear development in the Northwest. I understand that after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, he wrote a single spaced letter to his constituents in Montana explaining that the world had changed.
Yes, that's right.
And that even the scientists were recognizing their role had changed within our culture. And could you talk a little bit about how that affected him? And then the second part of the question, if you could talk a little bit about the vast nuclear development that occurred in Montana while he was senator, meaning all of the nuclear weapons, all of the nuclear capability that came to Montana during his watch. How did he feel about that? Did he promote that? Did he take exception to it?
Well, the first part, I can answer the first part better than the second. Yes, he was very much affected by the atomic bomb. The first thing that affected him was Pearl Harbor. He said that he was an isolationist before Pearl Harbor. He ran for Congress for the first time in 1940, and he didn't, he was just first time out, he didn't get the Democratic nomination, but he was running on a kind of peace platform. But Pearl Harbor changed that. It also eliminated Jeanette Rankin, who was the represented Montana as a Republican, of course, in the House of Representatives. She voted against going to war with the Japanese after Pearl Harbor, and that was the end of her political career, but Mansfield was a man of far-seeing intelligence, and he saw immediately, that the nuclear bomb was going to change nations and the relationship among nations. And he wrote this, as you say, he wrote this letter. Some nuclear scientists had briefed him. They came and briefed members of the House of Representatives where he was. He was on the Foreign Affairs Committee, about the nuclear weapon. And he realized very early that, as he said, there is no secret here that other people can't find out. There's no way it's going to be a secret just for the United States. And it's got to change the way nations relate to one another, or else we're all doomed. And that was the burden of his letter that he wrote back here. It's quite a powerful piece of writing. He was a wonderful writer. You know, he was actually terrific. He's a guy who had the reputation of never saying anything, you know, because he'd be on these television programs like Face the Nation or Meet the Press. The answer, nope, yep, don't know. But he was an excellent writer. And that was a powerful piece, and he saw it right away. And then in 1946, he was on a trip in Japan, and he went to Hiroshima. And he wrote about that in his little diary. I don't think he wrote about it publicly. You know, that just everything was flattened for miles and miles around. And his reaction was, how can human beings do this to each other? On the nuclear part here, the only thing I know that he commented on was, you know, the placement of these Minuteman missiles in silos. And he didn't argue with it. It seemed to me he was rather proud of it. Montana should have such an important place in America's defense. There was talk about building some nuclear facilities of other kinds, but it never amounted to anything as far as I know. And I don't know that he took much of a role in that. He did not have an allergy. I mean, he wasn't a guy who was like afraid of nuclear things per se. He worked closely with the Japanese while he was ambassador to get President Carter to accept the idea that the Japanese could have a nuclear reprocessing plant, a plant to reprocess or work on spent nuclear fuel that produces plutonium, although that's not the purpose of the operation. Because he thought the Japanese were not going to make nuclear weapons. They could be trusted, and it was under international inspection as well. But that letter he wrote was quite a letter. You had a question?
Oh.
Unless I've already answered it.
No, I was wondering, we all know how Lyndon Johnson shaped the Senate under his watch. And how did Mike shape the Senate in those long years?
The question was, we all know how Lyndon Johnson shaped the Senate, but how did Mansfield do it? He did it an entirely different way from Lyndon Johnson. He changed the Senate. He democratized the Senate. Lyndon Johnson wanted to have all power in his hands. He was a great believer in political power. And any office that you held, if you wanted to be on a committee, or you wanted to get your bill passed, or you wanted to be on a delegation to go to Timbuktu or whatever, you had to deal with Lyndon Johnson. And there would be a price later. He would come by and say, you got to vote this way on some legislation that he wanted or thought was in the best interest of the country. Lyndon Johnson ruled over the Senate like a Texas straw boss rules over a bunch of laborers and working on the roads or something. Mike Mansfield was the complete opposite. He did not feel that it was up to him as Senate Democratic leader to tell anyone how to vote. He could ask them, he could appeal to them on the basis of national interest, but he never traded any votes for anything. He never put pressure on anyone. He would ask them if they would consider this view. Instead of him determining who was going to be on what committee, he opened the thing up. There was a committee of the Senate Democrats in existence, which was a shell because Johnson just ran it. But under Mansfield, the people on this committee actually decided who was going to be on what committee. If you wanted to make application, you make application to this committee and they discuss it. There would be 8 or 10 senior Democrats sitting around and they'd vote. By secret ballot, by the way, as to who should be on whether you should get the job or not on this particular committee. He was as aware and as paid as much attention to Republicans as Democrats. This may surprise you, knowing what Mike Mansfield's views are. One of the people who came to his funeral leaning on the arm of an aide and with a cane, barely walking into the chapel, was Jesse Helms, with whom he had an excellent relationship. There's a letter, which I've seen, from Helms to Mansfield, appreciating his leadership. Although the two guys, they see eye to eye on hardly anything. He worked closely with the Republican leaders, Everett Dirksen and Hugh Scott. And he led the Senate because the other senators had complete trust and confidence in him and his fairness and integrity. And there's never been anybody like him in the leadership capacity in the Senate, as far as I know, and there will never be another, I'm sure, like him. The Senate, when he came, was known as the Senate Club, and there was a bunch of elders of the Senate, many of them from the South, because the South had the greatest seniority, who got together and decided what was going to happen. He opened it up, and the Senate ran an entirely different way. Johnson was not happy with this, and Johnson felt that Mansfield should crack the whip. And on some of these tapes that Johnson made surreptitiously, you probably heard some of them on the radio, telephone tapes of his conversations. He was arguing about Mansfield, and he once was believed to have said, "Why can't I have a politician as my majority leader rather than a saint?" But in fact, the record of the Senate and the Congress under Mansfield's leadership is as good as any, better than almost any, despite the fact that he would not do those things to get legislation passed.
Well, it just seems so mysterious and so subtle because you're working with all these egos. I mean, these are all politicians. And that's why I asked the question, because it mystifies me as to how they do it.
Yeah, well, that's it. You're working with a lot of egos, but they knew that the person they were dealing with had no ulterior motives. He had nothing in mind other than the interest of the United States. He was dealing with everyone fairly. Before the big civil rights debate in 1964, where the big major breakthrough towards civil rights legislation happened, and it was a tough one because we had to get cloture. They had to get 2/3 of the senators agreed to cut off debate, or the Southerners were going to filibuster it to death. before that debate, he called in Richard Russell, the leader of the Southern Democrats, to his office, and he told him exactly what he was going to do, how they were going to do it. He said there's not going to be anything, there's not going to be any pressures, there's not going to be anything behind, no hidden deals, there's not going to be anything that you don't know about. But this is important for the United States, and I think we're going to win, and we're going to get closer. And Russell walked out of there wondering what he had up his sleeve. Why is he telling me this? But in fact, he did exactly what he told Russell. That was his way. It worked. It's back in the way back.
To follow up on what you're saying, the difference between him and Johnson, in the book that the Senate Secretary wrote, he said that Mansfield was called into, Johnson called him in, and they were arguing about something, and when Mansfield left, Johnson said, "Why can't my Senate Majority Leader agree with me?" And Mansfield replied, "I am not your Majority Leader, I am the Majority Leader of the United States Senate."
Well, this was a very interesting episode. In 1968, after the Tet Offensive, when this country was suddenly shaken by what was happening in Vietnam as it never had been before, General Westmoreland asked for 206,000 more troops, although it was supposed to be a great victory. Johnson went into a huge policy-making thing. He'd agreed to make a speech on the 31st of March, 1968, discussing Vietnam. And on the 27th of March, he called Mansfield down to the White House. They had a meeting that lasted for 2 hours in the cabinet room in the White House. Johnson was trying to persuade him to send more troops to Vietnam. And Mansfield did agree that they could send a small number because some troops had gone without their backup, without their logistical group. And he said, yes, you have to do that. But for the rest of it, he said, no, you ought to be getting out, not getting further in. You ought to have a bombing halt. He remembered this conversation. The man's memory was absolutely incredible. He told me about this conversation in detail in 1998. He's 95 years old at this point. Later, by accident, sort of, yes, by accident, not sort of, I learned that Johnson had surreptitiously taped this meeting. And under special dispensation, because Senator Mansfield asked for it, the tape of that meeting was made available to him, or to me. I mean, it's very hard to hear, but I spent 2 days listening to this tape. And it's unbelievable to me, the accuracy of his recall of this conversation, which took place in 1968, and this is 1998 when he's talking about it. At any rate, Johnson, at the end of the meeting, unfortunately, the tape ran out after 1 hour and 13 minutes, so we don't have the end of the meeting. But Mansfield's recollection, meeting ended, Mansfield has refused Johnson's request to help him send more troops, which he must have known he was going to do. I mean, he knew what Mansfield thought. He walked over to the door of the cabinet room that leads into the hall that goes into the Oval, put his hand on the doorknob, and he just said something like, Mike, I just wish I'd had a majority leader who supported me. Or he may have said, I wish my majority leader had supported me. It's a little unclear. I've spoken to Mansfield about this 3 or 4 times, and each time he's got a little different formulation as to what Johnson said. It's also unclear what he responded, because one story he told was, he said, well, Mr. President, I'm not your majority leader. I'm the Senate's majority leader. He certainly believed that. But at other times, he told me he didn't say anything, he just left. So I'm left kind of not too sure exactly what he said, although Frank Vallejo in his book does tell exactly the story that you tell. Maybe it doesn't pay to know too much because it just gets you a little confused. I guess I haven't gotten to that point in my writing, and I'm not sure how I'm going to handle it. I think I'm going to just put in the best way that I can, that seems most right to me, and put an asterisk or something saying that this story has been told even by Mansfield several different ways, and I'm giving you my best guess. But he said many times, and to me and to others, he served with President Kennedy, President Johnson, President Nixon, President Ford. Not under them, with them. He served under President Carter and President Reagan as their ambassador. He worked for them. But as Senate Majority Leader, he was the leader of the United States Senate. He paid due respect, a lot of respect, to the President of the United States. But there's no way they were going to give him an order. That's not the relationship between the Senate and the executive branch of government that Mike Mansfield believed in. Joanne?
Well, the question is related to this. Actually, my question was, given the limitations of the Senate in a non-declared war, I think you have written and others have pointed out that Mansfield said his greatest disappointment was the fact that he could not do something to stop the escalation in Vietnam. Why do you think he took that so seriously or so greatly, again, given the fact that there were real limitations on what he could do? Maybe he just felt it was such a wrong thing.
It's a very difficult question. What weighed on him, I think, well, what really weighed on him was what a waste, and he knew right from the beginning this was a disaster. He kept telling him it was a disaster. Not only was it far beyond the national interest of the United States, he knew it wasn't going to work. He kept saying the real issue here is what's going to happen with the political situation in Vietnam, and nobody knew what to do about that. And they just, because they couldn't do anything about it, they just ignored it. He carried in his breast pocket every day a card which his staff provided with the latest up-to-date information on the number of American soldiers who had been killed and wounded in Vietnam. It's the one thing that I ever discussed with him that would bring up immediate emotion in his voice. Sometimes his eyes would water, say, what a tragic waste. He opposed it by talking to presidents, by sending them these many, many memoranda. Lyndon Johnson said to George McGovern, don't send me any papers, I got a whole bunch of history lessons here from Mike Mansfield. Got a drawer full of them. But he did not try until spring of 1970. He was not helpful to anyone who wanted to try to enact legislation which would force the government to stop the war. He believed firmly and fundamentally that the operations of the war and the operations of foreign policy was a presidential, maybe not prerogative, but the president was supreme in that field. There's a question, he was criticized for not doing more. In 1970, he changed his mind. He believed when Nixon first came in that Nixon was going to end the war as he promised he would do. And when the U.S. troops invaded Cambodia in the spring of 1970, Mansfield changed his mind. He was among the few that was called in by the president, called to the White House, told what they were doing, and then the president left, went to another room, and made a nationwide television broadcast to announce this, leaving the senators with Secretary of Defense Laird and Secretary of State Rogers. Mike Mansfield didn't say anything, puffed his pipe. He went home, spent a sleepless night, wondering what he should do. And he came in the next morning and he wrote two things. One was a memorandum for his files, which said, "I've finally come to the conclusion that the only way, the only group in America that can end this war is the Congress and the United States Senate." And after that, the second thing he wrote was a speech in which he advocated that Congress should stop the war. And after that, he helped Senator Church and John Sherman Cooper and others to put in legislation forbidding the government from spending any more money, because that's what Congress has, the power of the purse, won the Vietnam War. He did that very reluctantly. I asked him on a number of occasions, because he was criticized on this grounds, do you think you could have done more? Could you have, spoken out more loudly or done something that would have thrown your body across this situation? And he said, I always felt that it was important that I be heard at the White House, and he was one of the few that was heard. I think he felt he could have done that once. Senator Fulbright went that way and had hearings to point out the folly of the war. And Johnson just cut him off and never, basically almost never talked to him again. Didn't invite him to the White House. Nixon paid no attention to him. Mansfield always had that hope that he would be able to persuade the presidents and the secretaries of state and secretaries of defense, and that he never attacked them personally. It was not his way to attack anybody personally. He certainly had great respect for the office of president and never did the kinds of, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today, sort of thing. He said, I thought it was important to be heard until the moment when he decided that he had to act. And then he took it all very, very personally, because he saw so clearly, so early, what was going to happen. It was going to be tragic. And he kept telling them. And he kept telling people who knew much less about it than he did. But they paid no attention to it. He wasn't, as they say, in the loop. And so they went on.
Why do you think Marine was so insistent on his entering politics?
That's a good question. Of course, I don't know, because unfortunately, I never met Maureen. By the time that I started interviewing for this book, she already had Alzheimer's and she wasn't seeing people, although I didn't know that at the time. I think her family, her father particularly, there was around the dinner table, it was just all politics, She grew up amid Butte politics. And I think she saw, the real first question is, what did she see in him? She could have had any man, I'm sure, in Butte of a young age. Why pick on this penniless miner? Why go to him rather than some dashing guy with a car or whatever, She saw something in him that nobody else had seen. Maybe he didn't see himself. Not just love, but I think she saw somebody of potential greatness. And I think she felt he would do well in politics and accomplish something. I don't think she would, any more than he was in it for the glory. They were, you know, even as Senate Democratic leader, they were never in the Washington social world. They weren't like the Kennedys or anything. But I think she felt that he had something to contribute, and the way to do it was in the political route. But that's speculation on my part, because I really don't know. Okay, I'm going to take about 2 more questions, and then we can go on here all night, as far as I'm concerned, but not for you. Right.
Yes, if you can, during his stay at the university here in Montana when he was teaching, can you talk about his reflections on, he was very active in starting the University Teachers Union at the time while he was here, maybe his reflections on the union work and also his role as an educator and as he continued in his life, looking back at the role of education in Montana and across the nation?
Yes, he was instrumental in the teachers union. I'm not sure whether he was a founder of it or not. He might have been. You know, he'd been a miner for 9 years, but he had not been a union member because the Anaconda Copper Mining Company had smashed the union just about a little bit before he got there. But he was, you know, he was very much for the working people. There was a big controversy here at the university. I don't know all the details of it. You may know more about it than I do. But some professors were fired. The company, the Anaconda Company, and the Montana Power Company apparently were behind it. And there was a reaction by the faculty, and the reaction took the form of the union, among other things. He was proud to be in the union. Butte, where his Marine's hometown and where he had worked, of course, was then the heart of democracy, the heart of the Democratic Party in Montana. If you were going to win a statewide election in Montana, you had to pile up a big majority in Butte. And I'm not saying that that's why he felt as he did about unions and labor. I'm sure it's not. But it wasn't disadvantageous either politically. Educationally, he was the most popular professor on this campus. He was a terrific professor. He'd been to China as a Marine. He'd been following it. The guy had an incredible mind and an amazing, amazing memory. I mean, he would meet somebody. One of his former students told the story. This guy had been a student of Mansfield's in something like 1939 or 1940. And 3 or 4 years later, he was crossing the lobby of a hotel in Great Falls, and Mansfield was there, and he called out, "Hey, Sam, come over here, I want to talk to you." One of his former aides in the Tokyo embassy told me about a group of Montanans who arrived in Tokyo. And there was like 15 or so of them, and they came up to the ambassador's office. And every one of them, and he hadn't planned this or anything. He just, "Oh, Sally, how is your sister Sue? And, you know, how's your brother? What's happening with your cousin?" And so on. So on. One afternoon, you know every one of them. And when he left, this embassy official said to Mr. Ambassador, "How in the world do you remember all those people's names?" And Mansfield just replied, "Listen, when you're in politics, you remember people's names." But not every politician does. I mean, not the way that he did. So anyway, it was quite something. Okay, last question for you.
I know my family grew up in the same neighborhood as Maureen Mansfield. Demonstrations, as he was about the fragging incidents and the deterioration of morale and discipline in the military, really seemed to upset him genuinely. But yeah, he could remember people just incredibly. But one of the things I've always wondered about Mike Mansfield was how he was able to stay in power so long in this state without some sort of support from the Anaconda Company. And do you know anything about that?
Well, first place, he came along in public office at a time when the company's fortunes had politically had begun to decline. As you know, they owned all the newspapers in the state, except for the Great Falls Tribune. And they had started in the late 30s, really in the middle 30s, I think, to pull back from politics. They still had an important role, but not the whip-hand role that they had earlier. And they knew him. They had promoted him to the post of assistant mining engineer before he left. They knew what kind of person he was. He was for public power. He was always sort of at odds with the Montana Power Company, but he never clashed that much with the Anaconda Company, and he did try to protect the copper industry because he saw that as an incredibly important part of Montana. And he warned President Truman against a plan, which was then being talked about, to reduce greatly the tariff on imported copper. And he told Truman, if you do that, you're going to lose the Democrats from 4 or 5 states in the West. And Truman said, oh no, we won't do that, for sure. What I'm not sure about, and I'd like to know more about, for the purpose of my book and for my own intellectual satisfaction, is how a person with no political organization to speak of, labor was for him, but how he attained this particular stature above politics in the state. And people who would be for Democrats or Republicans or socialists or whatever, for other offices, would still be for me. After that nasty 1952 election with Joe McCarthy, every race he won by huge majorities. In 1970, his last race, he had come out for gun control because he had seen his friend John Kennedy killed. He had seen Robert Kennedy killed. A Marine, and he had been a Marine. He was a very loyal Marine to the last day of his life. He wore a Marine Corps tie clip every day. It was buried with it on. And the Marines, the commandant of the Marine Corps came to his funeral and helped to arrange his funeral. At any rate, a Marine in Washington had been in a bar or something and was killed with somebody with a gun. And he just got up in the Senate and said, we can't have this. Now, he was for a limited degree of gun control. He wasn't saying take away the rifles from hunters or any of that, but this was a very controversial stand in the state of Montana, and some people predicted he wouldn't win. In fact, they assigned a deputy sheriff to accompany him. They were afraid somebody was going to attack him during the 1970 race, but he won by a huge majority anyway. So I'm it's one of the things I want to find out more about is this political touch, that gave him this stature, and everything he ever did. He had stature beyond anybody else of a similar situation. When he was a Democratic freshman senator, he was the person that John Foster Dulles, the Republican Secretary of State, wanted to use as his liaison to the Senate because he trusted him and because he was respected in the Senate as a freshman. When he was majority leader for 16 years of the U.S. Senate and had a stature beyond any other senator, although he was soft-spoken, not your typical political star, but the respect for him was just incredible. And when he was ambassador to Japan, the Japanese considered him the greatest diplomat that ever came to Japan. After he got Carter to agree to let the Japanese run this nuclear reprocessing plant, one of the Japanese newspapers, the Mainichi Shuman, one of the national newspapers, wrote an editorial that was headed, "A Giant Walks Among Us." And Mansfield said, "I'm no giant, I'm just a guy trying to do his job." That was what he was like. Anyway, thank you all for coming and listening.
When I got my first assignment in the State Department, it was to Kuwait. I saw the senator. He said, "So, where are you going?" I said, "Senator, I've been assigned to Kuwait. Been there once. Hot." And after 2 years in Kuwait, he was dead right. I'd like to tell you very briefly about two upcoming programs. April 7th, a Sunday, we're having a presentation on China by two former national intelligence officers. These are the most senior analysts with the Central Intelligence Agency, and they present a very interesting approach to China. That's April 7th. April 10th, which is a Wednesday, we hope to have, and we're in negotiations to accomplish this, a representative of the Palestinian Authority. This program would be in conjunction with the Model Arab League program that takes place at the university every spring, every April. So I hope you can join us for those events. And now let me thank, first of all, Courtney Lowry and the Kaiman. Just wonderful support, coverage, advertisements, and great enthusiasm, and we really appreciate that. Courtney, you and your staff are terrific. And for Dawn, I would say, it's the first time I've ever had goosebumps at a program. This was really a masterful story that you've told. It's not a story, it's the true life of an amazing man. And I think we could be here for a couple more hours, Dawn, but we won't do that. So join me in a great round of applause for this wonderful story.